Hello, everybody. We're going to talk today about regional orders. As you just read the chapter on this, these take a variety of forms. Think about it this way, though. Think about the United Nations sort of like an international order, a global order. It's all the states basically talking about things that are relevant to all the states. We're talking about regional orders. What we're talking about is there, there are reasons why states in the same basic neighborhood would want to meet and talk about things without the other states. It's just going to be easier. They care more about these things. So, for example, do Americans care about immigration into Europe? The answer is sure, we care about it. There's just other things we care about way more. But if you're in Europe, you care about immigration in Europe a lot. And so let's make it something only the European states talk about. So we need an organization to do that. And that would be, for example, the EU. So that's really the thing that we're talking about here is sort of, what things does a neighborhood want to talk about and how integrated do they want to do that? So let's just get some definitions and then we're going to talk about how they're related to each other. So what a regional order is this formal regional cooperation or integration. Um, so essentially it means there's like a actual thing that the states in this particular area get together and say we're going to cooperate on this particular thing or these particular things, and here's the process by which we're going to do it. That's all this means. And you saw some examples in the chapter of this. But let's just talk about some of the varying degrees of this. And again, the next slide is going to go into this more. So I'm just going to walk through and give you some of the definitions, and then we'll break it down a little bit more. So the least integrated of these economic integration is going to be the preferential trade arrangement, where just essentially it just says, I'll trade with you, you trade with me, and because I want to give you like a better deal, right? So I'm going to knock a little bit off the tariffs, or maybe you eliminate the tariffs altogether in some areas. But whatever my best trade deal is, you get that too. That's essentially what that means. We're still going to have some tariffs, we're still going to have borders, all that kind of stuff, but we're going to give you like 5% off type stuff. That's a preferential trade agreement arrangement. A more sort of integrated version of this is the free trade area, where you essentially remove all trade barriers. Now, all is a very that's not actually true. There just isn't a place where there's you remove all trade barriers except for, say, within a state itself. Probably the way to think about this is to remove many, and then of course there can be varying degrees of integration along this as well, as you saw in the NAFTA. So NAFTA is an example of this, North American Free Trade Agreement. There are some things that are free trade. There's no trade barriers. If it's moving from Mexico to the United States to Canada, there are no trade tariffs, anything like that. But not on everything. There are still some things that have trade barriers between those three states. So all is not the right word there. Many, and again, how much sort of makes a difference there. So the next sort of degree of economic integration is what we call a customs union. You saw a little video on that. Now, what this is okay, so this is just strictly buying and selling, moving things from point A to point B, and we're just going to not put tariffs on it. This is a recognition that can sort of throw off the economies of certain areas if you do that too much. And so what the states agree to do is harmonize their trade policies, meaning that the United States isn't going to make trade policy on its own. It would then work with the other states in this customs union to do it. Now, the United States is not part of a customs union at all, but say in Europe, France will make trade policies, but it doesn't do it without considering the trade policies of the others in the European Union. So that's a customs union. Again, it just takes it to this next level. If this is just we agree to buy and sell in a particular way, this is we have to think about how we're going to do this and make policies together. The next level of this is going to be what we call the common market. And what the common market does is it takes some of this stuff to a much stronger degree. But what it really does is it says, all right, so if this is stuff moving across the border, and there's not going to be any sort of penalty on this. Like, we're going to make sure you're not moving drugs when it gets to the border, but for the most part, if it's covered by NAFTA, it rolls on through into the United States. That's stuff. So, but we don't let people move across. What a common market does is it allows people to move across. And what we have in Europe is this thing called the Schengen Agreement. You're going to see this being talked about, especially in coronavirus days. The Schengen Agreement is essentially makes Europe sort of a common market where if I have a French passport, I can move across the border into any European state in the same way that, for example, in the United States, I can drive from California and Arizona and nobody stops me and says, hey, where are you from? Anything like that. They just ask if I have fruit, and if I do, I eat it and I move on. That's essentially it. The free movement of labor. So if I want to move to Germany, if I want to move to, Spain, it's totally fine. And there's no, my passport lets me do that. That's a common market. So you can see that that is another level. And if you have this, you're going to need more harmonizing of policies here. The next level is going to be economic union, where we're going to not just harmonize trade policies, but harmonize fiscal and monetary policies, because especially if people are moving back and forth. And this is really what the European Union is. It is an economic union like this. And to some extent, if we take this to an even stronger integration, this might say we're going to have a common currency, like, for example, the euro. That is harmonizing monetary policy right there. So some examples of this would be NAFTA, which is a free trade area, the EU, which is an economic union, Mercosur, which I actually don't know what that is. It's somewhere in this range right here, but that's the South American sort of arrangement like this. So let me just talk about this in a different way now that I've got this little picture in front of you. So what we see on this is as you move this direction on this, it's greater economic integration. And as we saw on that last slide, that often means greater political integration as well, and social integration. If we're going to have free movement of labor, we're going to harmonize our fiscal and monetary policies. This is not just an economic question anymore. It becomes political, it becomes social, it becomes even cultural to some degree. So political union over here, this is what we're just going to call a state. Think about the United States. The United States of America is a bunch of states, United States, so Virginia and Connecticut and all that. And they came together into this sort of agreement, and that they're going to share a currency, they're going to share this, they're going to share that. That's essentially just a political union, and just the easiest way to think about that's a state. Over here, we have nothing, where there is no sort of special agreement. Two states are just trading with each other, but there's no economic integration whatsoever. And then everything in between. So I'm going to use a relationship analogy here. So think about this as you don't know each other. So think about relationships for a second. Don't know each other, and this is essentially married. Married with kids. All right. So let's just talk about this just a little bit here. As you move this direction on economic integration, what happens is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but what happens is you get more and more cooperation. And the more cooperation you do, the more likely you need to cooperate in other areas as well, as we sort of saw in that last thing. Well, if we're gonna have free movement of labor, then we need to start talking about whether we need to harmonize our trade policy, our fiscal policies, our monetary policies, and things like that. And what we actually find out is it's very similar to relationships. Like, so for example, let's say you go on a date with somebody and you meet them for coffee on your first date. Totally cool. I mean, it'd be weird if you went out and bought a house together on your first date. So your first date, you go and you get a coffee together. Now, let's say on your 30th date, you go and you have coffee together. All you've done is had coffee together for 30 straight dates. Like, at some point you say, this relationship's not going anywhere, and you kind of call it off. And it kind of works like this as well, is as we move to something like NAFTA over here, then it becomes, so here we have, the US, Mexico, and Canada all sort of in this dating relationship. And the more that they do stuff on this, the more there is this need to make decisions about we have to cooperate. If we're going to cooperate on this, we have to cooperate in more and more and more areas. So there's this sort of drive to sort of move this direction. Does the United States, Mexico, and Canada need to harmonize their trade policies in some way, because this is creating issues they have to deal with sort of together? And yet, if it's not moving that direction, is this going to keep working at all in the same way if we're not getting to more and more cooperation, more and more trust in our relationship? Then maybe we need to call it quits and go our separate ways. That's definitely a part of this. There's definitely in the same way of a relationship, you're either sort of moving forward or you're moving backwards. There is a very similar sort of thing with this, that there's this sort of urge, this direction. If you follow the European Union, the history of the European Union from, say, 1945, when Europe was at war with each other, to today when they're here, there is this sort of pull this direction. That if we're going to do a free trade area, we're going to have to start talking about a customs union. If we're going to do this, we have to start talking about, well, then maybe we should let people be moving freely back and forth. And if we're going to do that, we better start talking about some of these things. And there is this sort of tendency, this direction. All right. Next thing that I want to talk about is still talking about what is a regional order, but we want to say, like, okay, great. I love all that idea about integration, all that kind of stuff, but what the heck schmack even is it? And there's two models. Model number one is, and let me just say before we move on, we can talk about the UN this way as well. Like, what the heck even is the UN? So two models. Intergovernmentalism, where you essentially say the EU is only a collection of states. The UN is only a collection of states. It's almost like the analogy would be with like a chat room. Does the chat room exist if nobody's there? The answer is, of course, yes, but it really isn't anything. It's just a place where you can come chat, but it's not really anything in of itself. And that's the sort of idea here, is that the chat room is the states in it. If the states all left the chat room would cease to have purpose and it would cease to really exist. So in this model, all EU power authority comes from states, and a state can choose to withdraw at any time. So it's essentially saying all the EU is the European states coming together, and so it's just a bunch of states, individual states, having conversations together, and that's essentially it. The other version, the other model, is what we call supranationalism, is that the EU is something beside and above the member states. Or we could say, for example, the UN is something beside and above the member states. Like, yes, the states give it authority and all that kind of stuff, but it's more than just the authority that it gives it. I'll give you another example, the United States of America. Which one of these fits the idea of the United States, not just the US, but the United States? So all these states come together in the United States of America. So let's say it's a civil war and South Carolina wants to withdraw from the United States. Well, the United States says you can't do that. You're not just free to come and go as you please. It's something more than that. Obviously, Brexit, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, but Brexit, Britain exiting the European Union, that sort of gives some leverage to this intergovernmentalism idea. But man, when you look at some of the things the European Union does, it gives a lot of leverage to this. So there's two models of thinking about this. Neither one is right, neither one is wrong. They're just ways to think about this and to think about organizations like this. All right, so take a little closer look at what the EU actually is and what it does, and we will come back and talk about this term called functionalism, which is a super important term.